You have said something you cannot take back. Not because you are cruel, not because you are weak, because in the space between what happened and what you did, a space that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, something moved faster than your judgment. And by the time your reason arrived, the damage was already done. You know this pattern. The moment pressure appears, a confrontation, a crisis, a humiliation in front of others, something shifts inside you. The thinking stops. The reaction begins. And afterward, in the quiet, you replay it. You ask yourself why you couldn't just hold it together. Why other people seem to move through chaos without losing their footing while you get swallowed by it. Here is what nobody has told you. The problem is not your emotions. The Stoics were not asking you to eliminate them. The problem is something far more precise and far more correctable. There is a single moment in the sequence, invisible and almost instantaneous, where everything is still in your hands. Almost no one knows it exists. This video is about that moment, and what you do with it will determine whether pressure destroys your thinking or sharpens it. In 1996, neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux published research that fundamentally changed how we understand emotional reaction. What he mapped was a neural pathway so fast it operates beneath conscious awareness entirely. When a threat is perceived, a raised voice, a sudden accusation, a catastrophic piece of news, the sensory signal does not travel first to your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational evaluation. It travels first to the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, through what LeDoux called the low road, a direct thalamo-amygdala shortcut that bypasses rational processing by approximately 200 milliseconds. The amygdala fires. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the system. The body enters threat response mode. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of you that reasons, evaluates consequences, and chooses how to respond, receives the signal 200 milliseconds later. By then, in many people, the reaction has already begun. The voice is already raised. The door is already slammed. The words are already said. This is what psychologists call amygdala hijack. It is not a character flaw. It is an architectural feature of the human brain, a survival mechanism designed for a world where hesitation meant death. But here is where it becomes interesting. LeDoux also documented what he called the high road, the slower cortical pathway that, when trained, can intercept the amygdala's signal before it becomes behavior. The brain does not choose which road the signal travels. But, with sufficient practice, a human being can learn to pause at the fork, to insert a delay between stimulus and response. 2,000 years before LeDoux published his findings, a former slave named Epictetus described this exact fork in the road using a different vocabulary entirely. He called it Phantasia. Phantasia, the Greek term Epictetus used throughout the Discourses, is most often translated as impression. But that translation is misleading in its gentleness. A phantasia is not a thought. It is the raw, unprocessed signal that arrives in consciousness before thinking begins. It is the emotional charge, the visceral reaction, the inner movement that precedes every judgment you make. When your manager criticizes you in front of the team, the phantasia arrives first. A hot, wordless surge of something: shame, fury, humiliation. That is not yet a problem. That is biology. Epictetus never asked anyone to prevent the phantasia. He knew it was impossible. What he identified, and what most people never discover, is what happens in the fraction of a second after the impression arrives. He called it Synkatathesis, assent. Synkatathesis is the moment your mind says yes to the impression. It validates the signal, grants it authority, and transforms it from raw sensation into a belief that demands action. When the impression says you are being humiliated, assent says yes, and you must respond immediately to protect yourself. When the impression says this situation is hopeless, assent says yes, and there is nothing you can do. Here is Epictetus in Discourses 1:20, with a clarity that should be uncomfortable. It is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. The disturbance is not the event. The disturbance is the assent, the internal verdict you issue in the moment of highest pressure, when your reasoning is most compromised. This is the fork that LeDoux was mapping neurologically. Epictetus was mapping it philosophically. They were describing the same 200 millisecond window. And in that window, which most people spend their entire lives never knowing exists, you are either in control of your mind or your mind is in control of you. Pause here for a moment. Think of the last time you lost your composure under pressure. Not the event itself, the instant before your reaction. Was there a choice made, or did it feel as though the reaction simply happened? And if it felt automatic, what does that tell you about how thoroughly you have trained the faculty that makes the choice? The Stoics were not people who felt nothing. Marcus Aurelius wrote meditations during a decade of plague, military campaign, and personal grief. Seneca wrote his most precise letters from exile. Epictetus developed his entire philosophy while enslaved, with no legal rights over his own body. These were not men insulated from pressure. They were men who had built something inside themselves that pressure could not dismantle. Marcus Aurelius called it the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the command center of the rational soul. In Meditations the 8th, 7, he wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as a comfort, as a discipline. Under siege, under grief, under the weight of an empire, the hegemonikon was the practice of returning again and again to the only moment where choice was possible." This is where most interpretations of Stoicism go wrong. They present the Stoic sage as someone who has transcended emotion. That person does not exist and never did. What the Stoics cultivated was not the absence of Phantasia, it was the habit of not immediately assenting to it. The pause, the fraction of a second extended, through discipline, into a genuine moment of choice. Epictetus names this capacity Prohairesis, the faculty of rational choice. It is, in his framework, the only thing in the universe that is unconditionally yours. It cannot be taken by a tyrant, destroyed by grief, or overridden by another person. It can only be surrendered, and only by you, through the habit of assenting to impressions without examination. Men are not disturbed by events, he writes in the Enchiridion, but by their opinions about events. The emperor who loses his temper at a senator's slight has surrendered his prohairesis to a Phantasia. The slave who maintains philosophical clarity while being beaten has exercised his. This was not rhetoric for Epictetus. This was autobiography. And now comes the hardest truth in all of this, the one that makes the emotional work non-negotiable. If the mechanism is assent, and assent is a choice, then every time pressure broke your thinking, every time you said the thing you regret, made the reactive decision that cost you, collapsed, when steadiness was required, you made a choice, not a conscious one, not a malicious one, but a choice nonetheless. To not yet have built the habit that intercepts the impression before it becomes a verdict. That is not condemnation. It is the most empowering thing I can tell you, because what is a habit can be rebuilt. Prosoche means vigilant, continuous attention to the impressions the mind receives and accepts. It was Epictetus's foundational practice, described throughout the Discourses as the prerequisite for all other philosophical work. Each morning, before the demands of the day arrive, identify one recurring impression you accept automatically under pressure. Name it with precision, not, "I get anxious," but, "When I am criticized publicly, I accept the impression that my value is being assessed and found lacking, and I assent to it before my reason can evaluate whether that is true." The naming is the practice. You cannot intercept an impression you have never identified. Prosoche is the intelligence operation that precedes every other intervention, the mapping of your own automatic responses, so that when they arise in real time, they are not strangers. Epoche is the deliberate suspension of judgment. In Stoic epistemology, it was the practice of withholding assent from an impression until reason could evaluate it. Applied to emotional life under pressure, it is simpler and harder than it sounds. When a Phantasia arrives, the surge of threat, humiliation, fury, or panic, do not act from it for 10 seconds. That is the entire practice. 10 seconds in which you are not suppressing the emotion, not performing calm, not pretending the impression did not land. You are simply not yet assenting to its demand for immediate action. Marcus Aurelius practiced a version of this by asking himself, in the moment of provocation, what is actually happening here? Stripped of the story I am adding to it. The person was late. The person criticized the work. The news was bad. These are facts. Everything else, the narrative of disrespect, of catastrophe, of personal attack, is assent operating on a Phantasia. 10 seconds of Epoche is enough to begin separating the fact from the verdict. In On Anger, the 36th of Seneca describes a practice he conducted every evening without exception. He would review the day's interactions not for what others had done, but for where his own judgment had failed. What bad habit did I master today? In what way am I better? Were my actions just? How can I improve? The questions that matter for building a pressure-resistant mind are these. Where today did a Phantasia arrive and I assented before examining it? What did I call them provoking me that was more precisely me failing to exercise epoche? Where did I surrender my prohairesis? And at what cost? This is not self-punishment. Seneca is explicit on this point. The examination is conducted with the same tone as a trusted mentor reviewing a student's work, clear-eyed, rigorous, without contempt. The goal is not guilt, it is calibration. Every evening's examination sharpens the next morning's Prosoche. Over months, the gap between Phantasia and response grows. The mind becomes not cold, not unfeeling, but genuinely, durably steady. Pressure does not reveal character. That is a comfortable lie. Pressure reveals the degree to which you have trained the faculty that governs your response to impressions. Every person who has watched you lose your composure, including you, was not witnessing a personality flaw. They were witnessing an untrained hegemonicon meeting a Phantasia it had not yet learned to hold. That is correctable. It has always been correctable. The Stoics spent their entire philosophical lives proving it correctable, under conditions far more extreme than most of us will ever face. The fork in the road that LeDoux mapped is real. The 200 millisecond window is real. And the practice of extending it, of learning to pause at the fork, to examine the impression before granting it authority over your actions, is the single most consequential cognitive habit a human being can build. Marcus Aurelius, in a private note to himself, never intended for any other reader, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote it as a reminder, because even the most disciplined mind in the Roman Empire had to return to this truth daily, under the weight of everything the world placed on it. The practice does not end, but it begins the moment you stop assenting to the impression that you cannot govern yourself. If something in this examination landed differently than you expected, leave that observation in the comments. Not a reaction, an observation. That distinction is already the beginning of Prosoche. Subscribe if you want to continue building this. The next video goes deeper into the Stoic faculty of choice and why most people surrender it without ever knowing they had it.